Hey folks, today I want to talk to you about how to improvise up and down the neck using chord shapes and small pieces of classic bluegrass vocabulary instead of scales. Now, this lesson was inspired by a lesson I recently gave to a student, and I realized it would make a good video. If you are interested in Skype lessons, you can sign up at lessonswithmarcel.com. By the way, this presentation is pretty theory-oriented. If you're not into that and you think that any kind of musical analysis is a waste of time, as some of my commenters do, we're not going to get along today, Chief. But just so you know, this is a technique that lots of bluegrass improvisers use. I'm just presenting it using all of the fancy words that I would have learned in music school had I gone to music school. Now, normally I hear old-timers just say something like, play out of the chord shape. And I think that that teaching method is a little light on the teaching aspect. So instead, I'm actually going to teach you what's happening. And that means scary music theory words that will corrupt your playing forever. Ooh. It's also worth saying that this lesson will be way easier if you have some basic improv skills. You're going to need to create your own lines because the point of this lesson is not to just learn a bunch of licks. The point of this lesson is to learn a new way to think so you can create your own licks. Anyway, let's start by figuring out what a triad is. A triad is basically a three-note chord made of a root, a third, and a fifth. As in the first note of a major scale, the third note of a major scale, and the fifth note of a major scale. Today we're only talking about major triads, but other types of triads exist too. This concept is basically the foundation for most chord types. Go do some Googling and you can figure it out. But this stack of notes, this triad, can happen in a couple different ways. For instance, the root note can be the lowest note in a triad, in which case we have 1, 3, 5. We call this root position. The root note can also be the top note in the stack, right? So you'd have like 3, 5, and then 1 as the highest note. We call this first inversion. The root could also be the middle note, which would be 5, 1, 3. We call that second inversion. Now, using this knowledge about inversions, we can make some deductions. We can say that on each group of 3 strings, or a string set, we should get 3 triads. Root position, first inversion, second inversion. We get 1 of each inversion. I know that sentence might feel like nonsense to you right now, but let me show you. Okay, so let's say that right now on my G, B, and E string set, I'm looking for G major triads. If you want to find them on your own, you should pause the video right now and go look for 3 G major strings on your G, B, E string set. Make sure every chord has a root, third, and fifth. Seriously. If you want to go do that, do it now, because otherwise I'm going to spoil it. Okay, so in the key of G, the notes G, B, and D are my root, third, and fifth. So the question is, where can I play G, B, and D together on this string set? So your first guess was probably your open G and B strings. There's a problem with that because then I can't play the fifth, or D, on my high E string, right? E is already a note above D. I can't play any negative frets, so that's a dead end. Instead, I might notice that I have a G note on my high E string. That's a good start. And below that, I have an open B string. But then there'd be no way to play that D note on my G string, so that's a dead end too. Instead, I can play the D note on my B string and the B note on my G string. So my final stack is 3, 5, 1, or first inversion. The next place I can find any of these chord tones is roughly 5 frets higher. That's true of all of these. Here I can find a second inversion stack of 5, 1, 3. You probably recognize this one as D chord shape. My third and final triad, once again, roughly 5 frets higher, and a root position stack of 1, 3, 5. This one should almost look kind of like an A chord to you. Oh, like that. And now that we've reached the 12th fret, everything just repeats. So let's recap those triads real quick. Then let's talk about some classic improv lines. We're going to use the word cliche here, but I don't want you to think of that word with a negative connotation. I just mean that they're classic lines when I say cliche. Literally everyone uses them, and everyone uses them for a reason. You can still make great lines with them, even if they're common. So we're going to learn 2 cliches for every chord tone. Let's start with the root. So there's one cliche below the root that walks down to the flat 7 and back up to the root. It doesn't have to be used like this, though. For instance, we could just use the flat 7. The cliche above the root uses the minor third. Once again, we could just use the blue note. or just the other note actually. Moving on to the fifth of the chord, our cliches are going to look identical, but they're going to touch different blue notes. So the chromatic walk below the fifth touches the flat 5. Our line above the fifth touches the flat 7. Lastly, the third of the chord has its own cliches. The one below is what I generally call the dirty third. It really emphasizes the difference between minor and major. It sounds like this. Sometimes you just hear it like this. The second cliche over the third is what I call an enclosure. It circles the third. This is above the third. This is below the third. And finally, what? This is above the third. This is below the third. And finally, that's the third of the chord. Here's a recap of all the cliche lines. I know they don't sound super interesting right now. Just hold on. It's going to get good. To continue, let's look at some licks that we could build out of these cliches and triads. So the lick I'm about to play includes almost every cliche that we just discussed over our first inversion G triad on the G, B, E string set. It's kind of ridiculous. It's a little crazy, but it demonstrates the method nicely. Remember, here is our triad. The lick starts by descending using the lower cliche off the root. It continues descending using the lower cliche off the fifth. We use the dirty third in the enclosure of the third. Dirty third, enclosure, followed by the cliche above the fifth, ending with an enclosure, and then the root note on the high E string. It's everything we talked about. Let's move to another triad shape and let's build another lick. So our next triad shape was second inversion, so my stack is fifth, root, and then third. It looks like this. Let's build this one kind of slowly together maybe. So let's start with the dirty third cliche off of the third, so on the high E string. Then I want to use the cliche that's below the root note, but rather than the chromatic line, I'm just going to play the seventh. And then I'm coming down to the fifth is here. I'm going to play the chromatic line below the fifth. And then I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to use the open B string, and then I'm going to use the enclosure from the triad before. Let's find some more examples that aren't the triads that we already went over. So let's find our triads on our next string set. So we're going to find, I'll spoil this, we're going to find root position, first inversion, and second inversion. And all of the same cliche rules that are going to apply. But I want to show you an interesting way that you can find all of your other triads. They're going to overlap. So if the first triad we found was this one, the new triad is this. See how it shares a bunch of those chord tones? The old one up here was that. And the new one on DGB string set covers a lot of that same territory. Up here it was that, the new one's gonna be this. So it's not gonna be as hard as you think to find all of these triads for every string set, I promise. So maybe in our root position triad right here, what if we started with the cliche above the fifth? Then we played an enclosure on the third, play the cliche below the root, and then we'll do an enclosure on the third again. And then we'll do the cliche below the root again, but we're just going to play the seventh. You'll notice that sometimes I break up the enclosure. You know, you can't play it all together. This time it happens like this. It still works all right. And the reason it still works is because it's still kind of following this like back and forth, like above, below kind of thing. What if in our next triad here, I guess this one would be first inversion, what if we started with the dirty third, and then we could do the cliche above the fifth, and then just end on the root maybe. Hopefully you can imagine how you could create a million licks that all feel like kind of monster flat picking licks that will be all over the fretboard. I mean, you'll have to work on your taste and maybe hone your construction skills a little bit, but that's good for you. You can make these all over the place. I don't want to show you any more territory that you can discover yourself, but just imagine how big the system is. And your way forward is pretty simple too. You need to find 3 triads: root position, first position, and second position on every string set. We've already done G, B, E, and D, G, B, so the remaining string sets are A, D, and G, and E, A, and D. And like I told you before, they overlap, so you're going to have an easy time finding them because they're always going to share a couple notes with the triad that you found before. So get out a piece of paper, you'll be able to do that. The cliches aren't hard to memorize. If you can remember which chord tone is which, I bet you can put it together. Anyway, folks, I hope you like taking this lesson. I normally don't beg for subscribers, but look at this guy, Brandon Johnson. He's got like 3,000 more subscribers than me. What are you, joking, Brandon Johnson? I'm just kidding. It's just a joke. But Brandon Johnson, I will fight you at any Waffle House. You just tell me where and when. We can settle this once and for all.